Monotone flops can be quite difficult to play, so let's just try to get a little bit better in them. We have Ace Queen here. Prodigy is a very good player, of course. Just won the Cash Game Championship beginning of this year. Crushed all the other elite players, and he 3-bets against the button open. Pretty standard, 200 big blinds deep even. So this will be an interesting hand. We get called on the button and we flop a monotone flop. Ace 6 deuce all clubs. We do have the queen of clubs, very relevant of course. Also we flop top pair. So what do we do here? In general, ace high flops can be c-bet quite often, but not all the time. Monotone flops are c-bet a little bit less often in general, I would say. And as we can see, we usually want to choose a smaller sizing, but we will look into that a little bit later when we go into the solver and check what sizes are preferred on this type of flop. Prodigy goes with a little bit more than 10%. And yeah, this is of course not a standard sizing for most other flops. So playing this strategy and playing against that strategy isn't too popular probably. You have to, as in position when you face this bet, you cannot really fold that much. And you have to raise a little bit, which can be difficult to find the right ranges for both of those, especially if or when you have a lot of hands that don't connect at all with this board, like anything that doesn't have a club and not a pair, like 7-8 of hearts, even Queen 10 of hearts. They don't really want to continue, but if you're getting 11-1 or 10-1, then of course you cannot really fold that many hands in your range. And if you fold everything that is not a pair and not a flush draw, then you will fold a big part of your range. But we will get into that in a minute. Rigged Egg decides to raise here. And of course, if you raise for value here, you of course also need a bluff raising range. And we will see how that is going to be constructed in theory. So now with this hand, we have a pretty easy continue. We don't run to 3-bet here because we don't really, our 3-betting would be 3-betting for value, nor as a bluff. So just calling here. If we hit another club, we're not unhappy. And if we don't, we are often not in that bad shape either. Jack is of course not the greatest card, just because ace jack is always on our mind here. However, at the same time, how many ace jacks is Rigged Egg gonna 3-bet here? How many are they gonna have in the preflop range in the first place? 200 big blinds deep, maybe a few more than 100 big blinds deep, but at least 100 big blinds deep. The ace jack off will be 4-bet quite a lot of the time as well. He continues with a big bet here, which is, with this hand, we cannot fold here, of course. We still have a very good flush draw out, but we're not really that happy just because we don't really beat any value hands here, right? So hands that he goes for value with here are probably ace king plus, maybe ace king with a club even, and then some bluffs that might be low pocket pairs, king queen with a club maybe, but then we also block the queen of clubs. Maybe even 6-7 would turn into a bluff here. Not too sure actually, but that's why checking out the solver will be interesting in a minute. So finding bluffs is not too intuitive, at least. I mean, these players will probably find will not never find bluffs. But it's not like, oh, of course you have all those gut shots here, all those open-ended straight draws that you could find in other spots on other boards. So yeah, you of course call, but it's not like a snap call where you're fist pumping yourself. And the river is even more difficult probably because this is a 1500 big blind jam and you are sitting on ace queen with only top pair. Of course, this is going to be a hand that is only bluff catching because nothing would jam for value here that is worse than ace queen. So here, of course, the queen plays a big role as a blocker. A lot of flushes will be in this jamming range. I'm not even sure if sets like pocket sixes or jacks, if they raise the flop, probably not too often though. If sets, deuces, and sixes will take this line, I would actually maybe, but probably nothing worse. Like ace jack will probably not take this line, especially blocking some potential calls. So the main part of rigged X value betting range will be flushes here. And then of course, having the queen of clubs is very valuable. Might be one of the best cards to have here actually. Maybe the king might be a bit better. Also depends a lot on which of those cards Brick Deck would use as bluffs. So if he has more king queen off or king jack off with king of clubs, then let's say queen 10 off, for example, which he will likely not have here, then the king of clubs is actually a worse card to bluff catch because it blocks bluffs, whereas the queen of clubs blocks all the king queen suited, queen jack suited, queen 10 suited, probably even queen 9 suited. So a lot of flushes and not too many bluffs. And that's why he makes the call probably. And before we look into the solution or what rigged egg has here, let's jump into the solver and see what the preferred line would be in theory. Is this going to be a bluff catch here? What kind of hands should imposition be having as bluffs and as value bets? And what hands do we want to call here on the river? Also, what c-betting strategy do we want to play here? What sizing is the best? All of those questions are what we want to look for here. So 200 big blinds deep is what we start this hand with, almost exactly. Chippy V, because those games were rake free. We see a 2.5x open from the button, so everything looks fine from here. Small blind even 3 bets quite large, so 13 big blinds, pretty close to the solution here. And then the button would call 26%, 10% would be 4 bets. And yeah, queen 9 suited is right on the edge here, so he could definitely have it. Might play looser, might play a little bit tighter than this, who knows, but definitely no or not many offsuited cards in here. So king queen off would be the only offsuit hand or only offsuit Broadway hand that's not an ace. Ace queen would always continue, and even ace jack folds quite often, about 1/3 of the time here. All right, so now we head to the post flop action. We see an 1800 or 188 stack and 27 big blinds in the pot. For the small blind, let's go ahead and start with many sizes that we could see bet here. Let's just go ahead and insert as many as possible and then trim the tree later just to see which of these sizes are used most often. I don't think anything bigger than 75% is used here, but we can also just adjust later on and go from there. So the stabbing line is not happening here, so we can just use the automatic sizing. For the turn, they do raise here. So let's see if the raise size is close to what he actually used in game, which was a 4x raise. If not, we can adjust it later. Then small blind on the turn does not bet. How much do they bet here? Around 68% pot. So let's work with these sizes and see which I used. And then on the river, yeah, we can leave all these sizes in as well and see which ones I use the most. All in will be added automatically. So I think the tree looks good so far. And if not, if we need anything else, we can always add it later on. Right, so for the c-betting spot, we see this 10% size is pretty much the only one that is being used. And that just has to do with this board type, monotone flops. You pretty much always want to bet as little as possible on earlier streets. So on the flop and even on the turn, you bet rather small with this on these types of on these types of bets on these types of boards, so monotone boards. And then on the river, you pretty much polarize a lot and go for value and for bluffs. And therefore, this 10% size is pretty spot on. And we can see pretty much every hand just mixes here. That's pretty pretty interesting, actually. Almost every single hand, ace-3 is checking more often, but everything else almost mixes exactly 50-50 bets and checks. Pretty easy if you know that. And then against the bet, yeah, you can only fold 15% of your range here and have to raise 21%. So those 21% are going to be probably the most difficult part here. We can see that even king queen off without the club has to call here almost always, which does feel super awkward probably. I mean, imagine you have king queen without a club and you have to continue on this board. You could be completely dead, but you just have to call your king high. But that's just because of the odds, right? King jack without a club or the suited versions without a club can start folding a little bit more often. King 10 even has to call sometimes, or bluff raise. Queen 10, same. Jack 10 calls sometimes. Then Jack 9 can fold almost always. So these Broadway hands with a backdoor straight draw, that is probably the only reason they can continue here, because they could potentially make a straight. But everything worse than that without a club just has to fold. And yeah, 9-7 as well, 9-7 of hearts or spades or diamonds just has to continue because of backdoor straight possibilities. 7-8 even more often, and raises 25% of the time without a club. So this is going to be difficult if you play against a player who hasn't really studied these spots, right? Rigged Egg probably has studied this spot a lot more often than the average player on mid stakes or lower. So he might be able to find bluffs even more often if he just goes for a raise with 7-8 suited more often than 25% of the time. So you could also overdo it, of course, if you're aggressive, but the average player on lower stakes, you can expect them to probably not bluff raise often enough. Then these pairs sometimes raise, but more often you just see these offsuit hands. Like king queen with a club is probably the perfect raising hand, just because it has not much showdown value, but a lot of bluffing potential and semi draw capabilities. Yeah, but also some of these aces have to raise sometimes as well, which probably does not happen that often against most players. All right, so here the raise size is also 50%, so around a 6-7x raise size, which is even bigger than what he used in game, which means that when the raise size is smaller, the raising range will likely even be wider. So let's go with a 4x raise size here and see how that looks. Right, and now we have a mandatory raising range of 33%. 1/3 of your range just has to raise here if you use this size. Yeah, that is interesting. Maybe it makes it easier for button to play actually, because if you raise like a hand like ace-9 suited here, get called, and you can just check it down on the turn and the river. Or at worst, you face a bet on the river. Maybe that's easier to play than just facing bets on turns and rivers potentially. Who knows? But this is a lot of raising. So these low pocket pairs without a club have to raise 6x, 4-5, gut shot, 7-8. Yeah. And if that raising range is that wide, then we also have to call a lot. So what's the worst hand that has to call here? I mean, I'm not really counting these 6% frequencies, but yeah, 7s without a club has to call the raise here. Very uncomfortable as well. But again, if you're folding too much against such a small raise, then they just print money with their bluffs. Given that they raise that often in the first place, of course. All right, well, we don't 3-bet ever here, which is also good to know. Probably just very hard to balance here if you want to raise with your flushes. What bluffs are you going to go for? King, queen, probably, but what else? Probably pumping the pot up, the 200 big blind pot as well, with too many weak hands as well, out of position. So we just play a pure calling range here. And then on the jack, we could implement the donking strategy, which makes it more complicated, but let's just not go for that. On the turn, this sizing is also spot on. So the biggish sizing, but not an overbet or a pot bet, is the one that the solver would only go for. Here, what kind of hands do we see? Pretty much everything. Even top pairs, the lower ones, go for a bet. Probably they fold out better ace-x hands in the small blinds range and might get called by like pocket tens with a club, jack x with a club. Well, jack x probably not in our range with only one club, but probably weaker pocket pairs that have a draw. And then third pairs, pretty much bluffing, I would guess, semi bluffing with the club, and then just preventing to encounter a lot of sets here when we block that. So this hand could be, or these hands could be good bluffs. Low pairs. These probably serve well as bluffs on 4 flush cards or 4 flush rivers. When the river is a club, then your semi draws will not be a bluff anymore, so you want to have some in your range. King, queen, of course, no showdown value, but a lot of draw equity. And then some of those gut shots are even good enough as well, because they literally have no showdown value either. But at least they have some outs against some of the small blinds range. And against that bet, yeah, we see that a lot of these higher ace-x hands have to fold already. So ace-king even folding more often than it's calling. Yeah, having a club is pretty much the thing you want to have here. For these under pairs especially, and even for ace-x hands. So even just a pure ace-x is not worth a lot here. Just because having clubs or blocking clubs is much more important. So ace-queen with the queen of clubs is a clear call. You can look at the equities. Yeah, 17.5 big blind call. That is very clear. Again, given that the button has a range that is balanced here and includes a lot of bluffs. So let's head to the river, see what's going on there. Here we don't have a donking range. And the jam is actually the one sizing that is used here almost exclusively. Which again speaks for the fact that we want to play a little bit more cautious with a little bit smaller bets on flop and turn, and then just pile money in on the river when we know pretty much exactly where we stand. The board is so dynamic that anything can shift equity so much. Like any set can be literally worth nothing on the river if a club turns out to come. But when we are on the river, we know pretty much exactly what we have here. Either we have the nuts or nothing, basically. Of course, we have a lot of hands that are in the middle here. So jacks, tens, those can be called by better hands as well. But they have very high equity. And we see that here in the equity graph as well. At one point, it's just all hands are better than most hands in the small blinds range, or all hands are worse than the small blinds range. So that's also why these middling hands don't bet here anymore. Two pair just checks every time, and second pair is also not bad enough to bluff. However, third pairs, even without a club, low pairs, some of those also even without a club, and king highs with a club blocking flushes. Those are all hands that want to bluff here a little bit more than 50% of the time. Sets are pretty much on the edge here, so fives are just barely betting here for value. Most of the time they are checking, deuces almost always checking, and sixes are just good enough to always go for a value bet here. And of course, flushes always jam it in. So what about our calling range against the jam? We have to call 43% of the time, which, given the bet size, is not little, right? Ace jack without a club has to call 50%, so that is indifferent. Two pair, even top pairs, which does include our hand ace queen. And here we see that it's pretty clear that anything that does not have a club does not want to think about calling here. And those that do have a club can call most of the time, but they're pretty much indifferent as well. It's just that having the club blocks so many flushes that we can call them. We have to call them at some frequency in GTO. The king is actually a better hand to bluff catch here, as we can see. We can look at the EVs. So yeah, slightly higher EV. Well, it's not insignificant, 1.5 big blinds more than the queen. So having the king of clubs is actually better here. Two pair, again, the ones with a club can call every time. And if we don't have a club, then we mostly have to let it go. Sixes are just on the edge. We basically saw that because the button would be jamming sixes here for value as well. So jacks and aces can always call because they actually beat value. Sixes not so much because we saw that fives and deuces were not that often in the button's range in the first place, and also they don't jam that often. So sixes are also indifferent here. And yeah, almost at 0 EV. And then flushes, of course, always call. So, of course, all of this only holds true if our opponent on the button can find all of these bluffs that raise the flop, barrel the turn, and then jam in 140 big blinds as a bluff on the river. If that is not happening with some of these 6-7 hands, some of these low pairs, and even some of these pocket tens, for example, then we just have to fold pretty much everything that is probably everything that is not a flush, because imposition would just be under bluffing so much. So let's have a look at what rigged egg did actually have here. Pocket eights. And while we just saw that pocket tens are in here as a bluff, pocket eights are actually not. So we already saw on the flop that pocket eights almost never raise. Funnily, actually, those hands without a club would raise here a lot, but those with a club can just call and continue comfortably in a passive way. However, the question is always, if pocket tens are raising, how bad is it to raise pocket eights here? If from an isolated hand perspective, it's probably not too bad. However, if we add up all the hands that could potentially raise here as well and barrel through, they can add up quite a lot, right? So we see even nines would raise here on the flop, but not make it to the river as we just saw. But if we have tens, we have nines, and we also have eights, maybe we also raise a little bit more often with pocket sevens. Maybe pocket fives are gonna end up in there. And then it just slowly goes down from here. We see nines would actually always check the turn. If we then bet eights, we bet nines, we can easily end up over bluffing. However, what we always don't see is the complete range of the player. So it might just be that rigged deck uses these pocket pairs as bluffs, but then doesn't barrel off with a hand like 6-7, which would in theory be higher EV, as we can see. Otherwise, the solver wouldn't have us barrel those through. But from a range perspective, it could actually just end up being a balanced range on the river, where bluffs and value bets end up being in a relation that is not over bluffing. We don't know that, we can just estimate it. But when you see your opponent play their hand like this, which is not part of the solver strategy, you at least want to look out for other spots and other evidence for them being a little bit over aggressive maybe, and then adjusting accordingly. All right, hope that helps a little bit to play monotone flops in 3-bet pots, and I'll see you in the next one.